This Choircast podcast is brought to you by Heretic 2 by Matthew J. DiStefano. Ready to challenge everything you thought you knew about faith? In Heretic 2, I dive into LGBTQ affirmation, rejecting divine violence, and embracing universalism in a bold post-Christian perspective. If you're done with outdated dogma and want a justice-oriented, inclusive view of spirituality, then this book is for you. Get Heretic 2 wherever books are sold, and start rethinking faith today.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
All right. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. My name is Nat, and I'm with my lovely cohorts, John and Bethany. Say hi, John.
Hi, John.
And say, I'm not even going to try anymore with you, Bethany. You're just not going to. So just do whatever you want, Bethany.
I never know what to do. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to be. I don't know what to do with my hands. I feel like I'm a total wreck when I'm on this thing.
Oh my God. She's Will Ferrell in Talladega Nights. Like, I
don't know what to do with my hands.
Car ran real good. I don't know. You're just, honestly, I just think it's because you're incorrigible, which is the highest honor, by the way. The biggest compliment I can pay any woman is that you're incorrigible. So don't be nobody wants to be corrigible. By the way, what the fuck is that? What is corrigible anyway? Can you be corrigible if you can be incorrigible?
It sounds like something that Anne of Green Gables drank with Diana.
Right?
I think that was cordial.
I've got a lovely corrigible with my mother. Now she says I'm incorrigible. I don't understand. She wasn't British. I'm not sure why it just affected that.
They were Canadian, but nice try.
Oh, incorrigible, eh? Thanks to Molson. All right, I'm going to stop doing this because this is already off the rails. But by the way, this is the podcast that we lovingly have called This Is Not Church. Because if it was church, you'd have got the hell out by now. Actually, if we even said like this was a comedy show, you'd be like, I think I'm gone. This is not for me. But we're glad you're here. Stick around. It gets better because I will introduce you in just a moment to our guest. And, you know, we have tried to stay focused on the fact that we always get amazing guests. I mean, John, like Bethany, right? I mean, I'm always just.
Oh yeah. Yep.
I'm speechless. Barely stuttered through this whole thing, but we do really, man. We have the chance to talk to the coolest people, and today is no exception. So let's get after it. We're going to talk to Reverend Dr. Sheri Pallas. She focused on dispelling the hate and exclusivity. That sounds like something that goes into like your Willy Wonka fizzy drink. Exclusivity caused by religion, addressing misinformation and healing religious trauma. She fights for the marginalized, disenfranchised, and the abandoned. Now, love is her religion, peace is her intention, and social justice is her goal. She hosts a weekly live stream, Fireside Creators, and discussing tough topics and changing the world one conversation at a time. And she has a new book out called We Have Ruined God, My Journey Out of Religion and Into Unconditional Love. And with all of that being said, welcome to the podcast. Sheri, how are you?
I am wonderful. Thanks so much for having me.
Wow, we're glad that you're here. Normally in this sort of preliminary question, we sort of lob a softball question about religious background. I'm afraid with you that's not a softball. Like having read even the first opening chapters of your book, I'm like, there's a lot. Like this is not going to be. Well, I grew up evangelical and later. No, there's like. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe just give us a little bit before we, just to kind of get us primed for the conversation, but maybe a little bit about your journey out of religion, which I know is the focus of your book.
So I was raised between two extremes of hatred. My father was a bigot and drug dealer, once nominated to be the Grand Dragon of the KKK, and who wanted to kill my son because he was biracial. My mom was a devout, some would say cult member of evangelicalism. And people would assume that my mom would automatically be good and my dad, of course, bad. But they were equally judgmental. They were equally exclusive. They both kicked out anyone who had ever done anything wrong to them or any perceived wrong. And then just kicked them out of their life. There was no forgiveness. There was no community. There was nothing from both of them, even though they were both on different sides of the spectrum. And the abuse was similar. It was a lot of emotional abuse. It was a lot of control. It was a lot of my way or the highway, even though they were so different people.
Well, and that was the impression I got just from reading the first few chapters, talking about your mom and your dad. I can't even begin to understand what that's like to navigate those extremes and still sort of land in that same place where you're pretty well screwed either way, right? I mean, go live with dad, who's this kind of monster, or go live with mom, who's this other kind of monster in some sense. And I know I don't know how does that, big question, but how in what ways does that shape your worldview? Like affect your relationships, kind of your self-esteem, all that stuff. Must do a number on all of that.
You said a word I didn't understand. Self-esteem?
Yeah. Sorry.
I'm just learning that right now.
John, could you mansplain self-esteem for us?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Let me. No, I'm not doing that.
You know what? You say that. I know you mean that sort of tongue in cheek, but John and Bethany and I could probably all say, yeah, we know what you mean.
Absolutely.
Like that was not something we were encouraged to have.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, it was derided as, what we would call today is woke, which God, I hate that fucking word. But, in the 70s and 80s when John and I were coming up, that was, there was a touchy-feely talk of psychotherapists and stuff like that. So we didn't talk about self-esteem. We were all scumbags and, unless Jesus came and rescued us. So
right.
Does that make sense? Is that sort of similar to I don't know.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I have been ruminating on a piece I want to write because it's recently struck me that when I was 12, meaning I had spent half of my life in the church because I was technically saved around 6, and I met my best friend, my childhood best friend at 12, roughly, or maybe 13. She asked me if we had 3 wishes, what would they be? And she started and said, well, obviously world peace. And I said, what's that? I had never heard, being in church a minimum of 3 times a week, going to a Christian school, being saved at 6, so spent half of my life in church. I had never even heard the concept of world peace. And that is just like, how do you get to go to church, the half of your life and never even have heard the term? And I asked her, well, what do you mean? And at that point, like I said, it was half my life. So to get back to your question about my parents, I really think that it was I have a very rebellious spirit. And anyone who follows me on social media would understand that. But I think they both gave me examples of what not to be. And my junior high best friend said to me, it's so strange that your dad was way over here and your mom way over here. And some stroke of luck, you ended up right in the middle. And I think it was just rebellion for both of them. I saw him and went, wow, I don't ever want to be that person. And I saw my mom and said, wow, I don't ever want to believe what you believe. I think, everything, both of them thought that being mean and proclaiming righteousness was the way it was supposed to be, as opposed to reaching out and being with your fellow man or fellow neighbor or any of those things. Total supremacy.
I think it's so fascinating how you never heard about peace. And now that I'm thinking about my own experience in evangelical church, I don't know if I heard much about peace either, besides like during Advent when it was one of the words for one of the weeks, peace, joy, love, hope. And I think oftentimes, unfortunately, there's like this type of language in the church where we're like building an arsenal of our voices of retaliation against whatever the sinful world is up to, and how we need to respond with violence. But most of the time just verbal violence, but still like there's a sense of violence with our actions and our words towards people that aren't in the same way of thinking, or even other Christians that don't think similarly. Like we have to be against them. We're known for more for what we're against than what we're for. And peace is one of those things that isn't really talked about. And so I'm curious about, go ahead.
You hear, peace on earth, goodwill towards men. Yeah. But that is nothing like world peace. right? I mean, peace on earth, goodwill towards men is a wish per se, like a blessing. World peace would be an act. So to know that it was never even part, the only time I think I heard that there would be peace on earth was when Jesus returned after, mass genocide and Armageddon and all of those things. So everybody had to die in order to get this peace. And then to couple it with the world peace and really a sense of community was something I had never heard.
Well, right. And, I mean, I'm assuming that you were raised similar to us, where this idea of, Jesus coming back was very vital to our future, right? So we couldn't have peace because we need war to bring about Armageddon, to bring about the second coming and all of that. So, I mean, now that you say it, Bethany, I don't think I have any knowledge or any memory when I was younger of hearing anything like world peace. It would have been a foreign concept at best.
Well, or it would have been ascribed to those naive hippies. It would have been like, oh well, let all these sort of naive pie in the sky people who like talk about world peace. It was always in a critical way that it was mentioned. It was like never the goal. And like John says, like there's an entire segment of the evangelical world that is like eagerly awaiting the cataclysmic end times. I mean, anticipating with great glee, by the way, and talking about what Jesus is going to do when he comes back. Because boy, is he going to be pissed, And you got the Mike Bickles of the world out there talking about how Jesus is literally going to slay millions of people with his own hand.
Well, I was just going to say that I think in my experience that there was a lot of peace within the church I was at, like peace between each other, good friendships, good connections, but not for anything outside of the bubble I grew up in. It wasn't for anybody else. It was for ourselves. And what was for other people was more condemnation and judgment. But Sheri, I'm curious about like what peace looks like at this point in your life. Like, you were mentioning self-esteem and like, what does it look like for you to experience peace within yourself? And then how does that translate into this God that you now see as unconditionally loving you?
It was a lot of personal deconstruction, not necessarily religious deconstruction, but really going through and analyzing what I believed about myself, what I believed about the world, what I believed about God. And I found that it was so easy to hate. It was so easy to react. And that true peace and love is more conscious thought. So now world peace actually means something to me. My brother means something to me. And I see everybody as my brothers and sisters. I see everybody as a family as opposed to a clique. But what gives me the ultimate peace is, and I always struggle with this term because evangelicals think of it in such a different way than I do now, and that term is surrender. If you look at all of the main religions and do a Venn diagram, they would all intersect at love and let go. Now, evangelicalism's is surrender to your husband. It's more of a victimhood surrender. I now look at it as go with the flow, as the woke people say. They in Eastern religions, they say, let the river take you. Thy will be done, O Lord. All of those things relinquishes your will and your demands and says, I'm just going to go where the river takes me. I have found that when I do that, not only does it lower my stress level, give me instant peace because it's like I can only control what I can control. And I've spent too many years trying to control things and just being miserable when I had no control about them anyway. So I literally just live my life in the flow. If this is what's supposed to happen, it's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy. But when I see something going awry or even good, it's okay. Let's go with this. Let's see where it takes me. And that gives me a lot of peace because things have worked out really well since I've been doing that.
Well, that's such a departure too from a lot of what the kind of religion that I was raised in particular, which had placed such an emphasis on knowing God's will for your life, which is such a weird, like outside of the evangelical church, to say that to somebody is a little strange, but we agonized over every decision. Should we take this job? Should we make this move? Should we, I remember like literally making the move to California in 2007 to take a job on staff at a church. And I prayed and I prayed and I prayed because the last thing I wanted to do was depart from whatever path I thought, God would have for me. And so, went to pastors and asked them to pray and so all this, but in very extreme versions of this, though, back in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, there was a movement called the shepherding movement, where it was very, very controlling. And I've heard stories of I have friends who were in these kinds of movements who they wouldn't buy a new car without talking to their pastor, and they would.
My mom wouldn't eat.
Yeah.
Would not select. She would before she opened the refrigerator, she would start praying about what would be the most nutritious. Which I always thought was funny is like, shouldn't you be doing that at the grocery store?
Well, it sounds
already at home.
There you go again with the logic and the reason.
Right.
But it's strange though, because now my whole what you said, that what led me to say all of that was that what you said about sort of being in the flow and kind of like just like kind of taking life as it comes is more akin to what I feel like whatever the quote unquote will of God is. Now we know what the will of God is. If you believe anything in Scripture, there's a couple places where we know that you're supposed to to do justice.
Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly
with your God. Okay, for this is the will of God. Whether or not God gets involved in the day-to-day minutia of whether you go left or right or buy a Ford or a Hyundai seems to me like the height of arrogance. So now that I've so for me, peace comes from, I think I have my mandate, and it's tough. Don't get me wrong; it's not an easy one because it is love mercy. Do justice, walk humbly with your God. It does mean that I have to treat people, a lot of whom I don't like at all. Let's make no bones about it. I do have to see them as human beings and as image bearers. And I do have to say, all right, Mr. Trump voter, I don't understand how you can do this, but I don't get to dehumanize you either.
Right.
And that takes a lot of work. So is that something you're finding some peace in as well, as just learning to, I guess, kind of a way to see yourself, but also a way to see other people with whom you might have confrontation or conflict?
Years ago, I would date myself if I said how many years ago, but before Deepak Chopra was even known, he wrote something in the San Francisco Chronicle, and I put it in the book because it just meant so much when I also had other confirmations of, thy will be done, live in the flow. And it was, be mindful of meaningful coincidences because those, and I'm paraphrasing, but because those will show your purpose in life. So it's a lot of, letting go and being mindful, not so certain. And I think that was one of the main things I lost with religion is the certainty. I'm totally okay with being wrong or not knowing right now and being in wonder. And that gives me a lot of peace. As far as working with people that I don't necessarily agree with or even like, I have come to the conclusion, and I say this as my highest self, I am not always at my highest self, but I like to say that they're on their own path. Whatever they are doing, because I think everybody has a path. As long as it's lined in love, then it's, in the right directions. But sometimes people don't choose that. Some people don't want that. They view it as weakness or whatever it is, but that's on them. As long as I am being who I need to be and reflecting my integrity and my morals and trying to walk in love as my daily practice, then that's all I need to worry about. I don't worry about other people's lives or souls or anything unless they're hurting someone. And then I think that needs to be addressed because that's social justice.
And that's an important distinction. I think we would all make that distinction as well. Like at the moment where your words become harmful, now I might have a problem. We had a conversation with a guy not too long ago, and that's where we had a lot of pushback because we're like, listen, I'm all for this up to a point, but there's a place where you cannot sit back and watch people be harmed and not take a position on that. So for a lot of years, I was very, very happy to just sort of, just not say anything about, say, my gay friends or, people in those, and meanwhile they're being harmed and there's no one, I'm not taking any opportunity to speak out on their behalf. And I'm like, well, then I'm complicit in their harm. If I don't, I don't have to go to war. I don't have to go, but I don't think we have the option to idly stand by. So that's, I 100%. Thank you for saying that. I agree with you 100%.
I love the meme. I think it's the naked pastor who did it. I could be wrong, but it's, if you're not getting hit by the rocks being thrown at the marginalized, you're really not involved.
Right. You're not close enough to them, right?
Right. Yeah. So, that is one thing that I really try. On my show last week, I had a guest that said that wanting your neighbor to flourish was loving your neighbor. I look at it as empathy. Carrying what your neighbor, feels, carrying that they're living their best lives and those types of things, which is contradictory to most evangelicals, because most evangelicals and a lot of religious people otherwise, including Muslims and some extremist Jews, but they are so focused on the afterlife as opposed to this life. And so they get so caught up with trying to control and say, oh, you're going to burn in hell, and then create a hell here on earth for everybody. So, I like to be focused to here and now, and what can I do to make anybody who's in front of me or anybody's path I cross a little bit better.
I want to go back just for a second on something that you mentioned about coincidences, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things I would say where, to use the title of your book, where ways that we have ruined God is within the evangelical church, that wouldn't be a coincidence, right? That would be a divine intervention. And it took me a really long time to break away. I mean, I left the church when I was 18 anyone who's listened to the podcast knows I stepped back in for a few years, but for the most part of my life, I wasn't within the church. But I was so indoctrinated by things like that when bad things would happen in my life, I would force these supposed divine interventions so I could try to correct my good standing with God, because I realized that in some way I had stepped out of alignment with God, right? And so I would look for these divine interventions, these moments where I could then reconnect with the divine. Is that something that you can connect with at all? Before you left evangelical church?
Well, not even before, because I'm still uncovering things. Gotcha. I have a mentor, and I saw her right before the Wild Goose this year and last year. But we were talking about how we became friends, and she started helping me. And it was when I was diagnosed with cancer. I had been writing the book for 4 years at that point, and really thought that I had grown beyond all of the evangelical nonsense and really just okay, this is bullshit. This is real. But the moment I was diagnosed with cancer, I called her and said, what did I do wrong?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's so self-absorbed. First of all, it's God knows you so much and what you're doing that you fucked up in some little way.
Right.
And so you're doomed to cancer. And she said, you were born. I mean, my mother, my grandmother, my aunt, all of those things, they all died of breast cancer. So all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, I must have screwed up somehow.
Right.
When death is a completely natural thing, and so is illness and all of those things. So I was even halfway through the process of this book and still looking at myself going, if I have cancer, I must have done something wrong. I must have pissed off God in some way.
Yeah. Yeah, Nat and I both have similar stories with our children. One of our children ended up in the hospital for some pretty major surgeries, some pretty major illnesses, and that was the first thing when we realized my son was going to have to go in for surgery. I instantly thought, okay, I pissed off God. I did something, and now my son's paying for it. And then I started down that whole road of okay, I will build up the good karma, and I will do everything in my power to build up enough good graces with God so that when he goes into surgery, he will have a better outcome. So I would do, stupid things. I mean, they're not stupid. I shouldn't say it that way, because they are good things, but I was doing them for the wrong reasons. At a 4-way stop, I was no, you go first, open the door for somebody. all these little things, right? That I would feel like I'm getting another little karma token towards a good outcome, right? And it's just another way that I feel like that our religion has derailed us from reality, right?
Yeah. I feel that too. That sense of like, if I'm doing well with God, then God's going to bless me more, or I want to be in God's good graces and not make God upset, and then something bad is going to happen. And I'm curious, Sheri, in your book, you did such extensive research on church history and the hypocritical nature of church and religion in general, especially the Abrahamic religions. And did you, in your research, did you see if that karma or reward punishment sort of mentality, is that something that happened later on in the Christian life? Or is that something that, I know that, part of the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism and the Protestant Reformation was to step away from indulgences and those sorts of ways of thinking. But it seemed like it just followed the Protestant religion too. Maybe not with indulgences, but definitely with like good and bad behavior and the choices that we have as life. So what was that research like for you?
I found it went all the way back. It's people have been trying to associate natural disasters or life suffering to a godlike figure since the dawn of man. I mean, we have cave writings that go back 35,000 years. They even found some that go back 300,000 years, looking to a higher power, usually in the sky. The one exception would be Buddhism. And that's what the inception of that was to stop the suffering from from attachment. Buddhism is based on a lack of attachment, saying that it will stop the suffering. That lack of attachment also includes blaming others for your suffering or attributing it to something else. All of the faiths, the prominent ones, believe in some type of karma. I was really surprised that the Eastern faiths also believe in reincarnation and a hell. So some, before this, I was like, well, you reincarnate or you believe in hell. But a lot of them believe in both, like a double whammy sometimes. But we're always trying to blame someone else as opposed to taking accountability. And I say in the book that God is the ultimate scapegoat. We give him credit, or it's his fault for everything. As opposed to, if I had to encapsulate the word in one book, it would be onus, or in one word for the book, it would be onus. And it's on us. Literally, that's the meaning of it. And it all comes back to us. For instance, one of the questions I really wanted answered in my studies was, why do babies get cancer? Why do babies die? If there is this benevolent being or this thing, I want to know the answer to this. And I, say child dies of cancer, but yet a football game is won and parking spots are opened. How could I reconcile this? And I reconciled it by coming back to us, by saying it is on us to be there for the family. It is on us to be there for a child. It is on us to make their lives less tragic in tragic situations. Not necessarily a God or a being that has any control. I now believe that God is the energy of love. So it is up to us to tap into that energy whenever we can. If we see someone struggling, if we see a sick child or a sick person in general, we need to be there for that person. And I also say that animals are better than us because they actually tend to their ill. They actually tend to their dead. Whereas we would stop by or step over a dead body and ask what they did to deserve such a crime. But the empathy, the compassion has just completely disappeared in so much of religion. But it matters. And I'd like to say something else to answer your question, Bethany. I now believe in these scales of life. It was an Egyptian tradition. And what they would do is they would put the heart on one side of the scales and the feather of truth on the other. And that took me from being, oh my God, I'm a piece of shit. I have so much to be shameful. I'm bound for hell, to I'm still alive. I still have time. So it's do better. The whole point is that the heart is supposed to be lighter than the feather of truth. And that's a karmic thing also. So I think what I always heard was what goes around comes around, or what you sow, yet shall you reap. It's across all religions, across all humanity. Be nice, get nice. But life has a lot of suffering.
It always interested me because, being raised in the church, karma was an Eastern religion. That was paganism. That was whatever. And I'm like, but then they would turn around and say, well, but if you do this, then this. Well, that's just karma. It's just the law of action and consequence, which actually now I firmly believe is, I'm in a place now where I'm like, okay, I don't believe God punishes people. I just don't believe he's in the punishment business. I believe we do a pretty goddamn good job of punishing ourselves.
Exactly.
If I walk into traffic tomorrow and get run over by an 18-wheeler, I don't think I get to go, well, why did God punish me? Well, no, you made a stupid choice. You played stupid games. You won stupid prizes. That doesn't always, sometimes you're paying the consequences though for other people's actions. And sometimes, they're not the result of your own choice. I find myself citing, I don't know if you know who Thomas Ord is, but Dr. Thomas Ord is would find himself in the open relational theological camp, and so he wrote a book called God Can't, which sounds to me like it dovetails nicely with what you're saying. Is like, listen, this notion that God is controlling is a narrative we've got to get away from. Like, God does not control love because God is love, and love doesn't control. And so this notion of in fact, his newest book is called The Death of Omnipotence, and it's really, really good. But this idea of this, we've used this term omnipotence to describe God for so long, and we have a certain set of what we think it means, and that means God is all powerful; he can do whatever he wants. That's a very Calvinistic sort of view of that, right? Where if God does it, it's good. Why? Because God did it, and God couldn't do anything wrong. So God has the ability to interfere, interact, do whatever he wants, and in all places and all time. Which then begs the question: then why is he an asshole?
Yeah,
because now your God's just a cosmic dick who absolutely can cure cancer, but usually doesn't. So I think Tom's approach and some other guys like him would say, well, no, that's not something God can do. And it's actually up to you and me to, he calls it, does he call it like conspiring? Basically, we're co-conspirators. We're called to be co-conspirators with God. And so our job is to find those places and act, in places where God really is unable or incapable of acting. And that really hacks at the root, though, of a big, huge problem inside of mainstream evangelical church, is because now you've taken away that crutch of, well, God, I can thoughts and prayer this to death. Just thoughts and prayers, and God's going to be the one responsible. The onus is now on God, not me.
Well, Sheri, you wrote a lot about, in the book, you wrote about ego and how much that shuts down those connections and shuts kind of almost that sin of certainty that Peter Enns talks about as well. The sense of we have a corner on God. We know what God is going to be like or do, and we need to behave appropriately so we're not in trouble or whatever. And I'm wondering, how have you seen the ego and how you describe it? And it'd be great if you described it here too. But how have you seen it shift your view of God, especially through the writing you've done?
Well, there were a couple really important points that changed my whole thinking. One of them was realizing that I was a more loving parent than God. I would never do to my child what God claimed to do with his. And the other was that we had killed more people in the name of God than God actually killed in natural disasters. So understanding those things really put our ignorance, or at least my ignorance, in perspective. And then it was like, okay, I've just been being told the wrong thing. Also looking at, the questions that I had a question of who was Satan, who was all of this stuff. And I no longer believe that there's anything outside of us per se. I mean, there's energy, there's matter, and those types of things, but everything is within our control. So I don't believe that there is some demon or devil sitting on your shoulder going, you better not do that. I think that's the ego. And I think the ego is anything that creates, I'm not speaking clinically, I'm speaking spiritually. I need to clear that up because I don't want anybody, at me going id or anything like that. But the ego is anything that causes separation, right? The ego makes us want to succeed, wants us to make it be better. My ego caused separation by telling me that I was a total piece of shit. So it works whatever you will believe in order to cause separation. So anytime, and Eckhart Tolle says if there's any problem, it's an ego problem. Wayne Dyer says ego means edging God out. So once I became aware of and internalized that demon or that devil and saying, how can I control this? I realized it's my ego. So whenever someone does something that I consider wrong or offends me in some way, I immediately check my ego and go, okay, is this an ego issue or is this a true offense to me, or an offense to me rather? So in controlling the ego, I think is the most important part of our lives. Now I want my ego to be filled and to really get it going when I help other people. Because there's nothing that makes me feel better than helping other people. When I get comments about the book and how it, raised someone's love level or something like that, my whole world shines. Far better than being number one salesperson, which I was all the time before this new life. Far more than any of the material things I had, because those material things are gone now. I gave them all away when I went on this journey. That really fills me up. So I think that we should recognize the ego, but also use it to the benefit of others as opposed to just ourselves. I would love all of the billionaires to get into an egomaniacal competition for saving the world or feeding children or doing, I did more than you. That's the way it should be, as opposed to I have more than you.
That's a lovely picture, by the way. I like that. Let's do that. Elon, I know you're listening. Like you could do more with just your billions. You know, like you could solve, like these people could solve literally 90% of the world's problems just by separating themselves from their mass and still be massively wealthy, by the way. I mean, I met a billionaire once. Did I ever say that, John? I met a billionaire?
No, but I was going to say, wasn't Elon asked this question? Why don't you use your billions to solve world hunger? And as opposed to saying, you know what, that's a good idea. Let's do this. His response was, you figure it out and I'll pay for it.
Right. Well, and
it's like, well,
there's no onus there.
Well, and there is a school of thought, and one that I'm increasingly more and more sympathetic to. That I mean, that even accumulating that much wealth is sinful. Like that is hoarding. That is just hoarding resources that you're never, ever, ever in 100,000 lifetimes you're ever going to use. And you have to. I mean, just simple economics says that's coming from someone. And again,
it's more than the money, though, right? Because that money gives him the power. That money gives him the into Russia. That money gives him control, greed, status. I mean, he's technically an incel with money.
Yeah,
he
absolutely.
Really is.
Yeah.
If he didn't have the money, he wouldn't have the power. So that's where the greed and power and everything comes in, that all of the faiths, all of the religions have shunned since the dawn of man.
Yeah. Well, and then if I was to say to somebody, in the church, say, well, maybe that person should just give away all their money. Maybe should sell everything they have and give it to the poor. And they'd be like, woke. And I'd be like, I'm sorry, that's something that Jesus said. Well, yeah, I mean, well, and here's the thing. What I love about Christians, and I still sort of count myself amongst y'all, okay? I'm hanging on by a thread, but is we pick and choose when the nuanced things. That verse, that story of Jesus and the rich young ruler has been nuanced to hell. It's like, Jesus wasn't talking to all rich people. He was talking to that specific young man because he had a problem with wealth. So the lesson of the story is don't let your wealth own you. Or maybe it's just that wealth owns you. And it's, maybe there's no escaping that inexorable pull towards self-centeredness and greed. I know there are generous rich people. I'm not saying all rich people are bad, but I am saying there is a level of wealth where you just go, this is inhuman. like what you have.
Well, and so much of what Jesus talked about when it came to wealth was about rival gods. Like wealth was a rival god, and it was something that people defined themselves from and found their identity in. And I don't know, I'm just like so struck on your comments, Sheri, about like having an ego for good and what that can, how that can like move people into a different way of living in this world. And then it made me think of like what you were saying earlier about like staying in the flow, like experiencing like, yeah, just staying in the flow of whatever God is doing in your life. And then I, from there I was like, well, what is that flow? Like, well, the flow is that love. It's not thinking, oh, I'm going to open my fridge and decide what I'm going to eat based on whatever God's going to tell me to eat, but more like, well, what is it that will move me more into that place of love for the people around me and for myself? And in that flow, it's like Father, Son, Holy Spirit. If you consider that part of your life, then that flow is in you and guiding you, but not so much of like, I need a parking pass or I need healing or whatever. I mean, you can pray for whatever you need to pray for, but like having that measurement, love being the measurement, I don't know, that ego for good, it's really impacting me right now. And I really appreciate that.
Thank you. I want to address or come full circle to the self-esteem question, because I think that the only self-esteem a lot of the people, the very wealthy, have is their money. So when you said, they got to hold on to it and it becomes a thing, if that's their whole identity and that is truly their only worth, then they would do so. And anybody else who they deem as their equal or even below them is just below them because of the money. So if they lost their money, who would they be?
Well, that's sad,
We all can find ourselves in those kinds of situations, though, right? We can find it. It doesn't have to necessarily be money. It could be something else that really builds our ego up, that becomes our personality. For a long time, I played music within the local community, and I had a lot of ego, knowing that I was somewhat well known at that time, right? And as opposed to just, like you would say, use your ego to find a positive spin on what you're doing. And I was out playing music, everyone was having a really good time, that should be enough. But instead, I had to like build an ego about myself and how important I am and how important I was. And so I think we all can fall into this trap of building an ego on from a negative persona or a negative side of us, as opposed to, like you say, use this ego for good, use this ego for bringing light.
But I think just recognizing the ego in you is a huge step. Because there's things that happen throughout my days, my weeks, my months where I go, that felt good. That was that just totally fed my ego. When you recognize the ego, it prevents it becoming part of your personality. It prevents it from becoming who you are as opposed to an aspect of what you are. So you can recognize the ego and go, yeah, I got that fed today, without needing that as your only source of who you are.
I can relate to what John's saying, because that was me in the church. That was where, so much of my identity was wrapped up in what I did on stage, whether preaching or playing music, whatever I was doing. So, and that becomes very unhealthy if that's, if it's disproportionately who you are. You know what I mean? Like I couldn't do that anymore. Or when I stopped doing that, I just struggled for a bit. Like, okay, well, if I don't do that, then what the hell am I? But so much of this has to do with, to me, the interesting thing is this sort of choice between, do I totally set my ego aside? And then because there's that mode of Christianity that says yourself is bad and needs to go away completely, and let just God come in and take over. And I think that's unhealthy and horseshit.
Well, you can't. The ego's part of you. Can you just set your arm aside?
So what do we have? I used to tell my youth. I used to be a youth pastor, and at least I had enough sense to tell them that God's not interested in a bunch of Stepford Christians. And they didn't get the reference, but I explained it. But I wanted them to lean into them being uniquely them. There's only one you, and how God will work through you is going to be completely unique than how God's going to work through me or somebody else. And this whole Christian life is not about Dying to self doesn't mean dying to who you are. It means dying to your self-will, dying to having to have your own needs met. There's all kinds of things we can say that are positive about dying to self that don't mean what the church has made it into meaning, which is you are terrible. Let's put these rose-colored glasses on God. So that was always one I loved. So when he looks through his glasses, he doesn't see you anymore because you're bad, but he let him see Jesus instead, right? And that just stems from that place of starting from where we're told that we start from a place of brokenness or from a place of being, just inherent, this original sin thing. So let's talk about sin, because I was reading through your chapter on sin and I was fascinated by that as well. That's a word that carries a lot of baggage too. Let's talk about that for a second. That's a very open-ended. So, what's up with the sin thing?
Yeah, just talk about sin.
So deep. Give me 2 words. Sin is how we control everything, right? Sin is, and by the way, I want to get back to just one thing before we move on to sin.
For sure. Yeah, feel free.
When our self-esteem is built on things that can be taken away, that is when trouble and tragedy comes in for a lot of us. Like you were saying, the musician, the church, those types of things, money, anything that can be taken away from you, you should never hold your identity in, because then your self-esteem goes way down or way up and just fluctuates too much. All of your identity should be held in the person that you are, in the person who controls the ego or lets it go, and then build off of those tasks, as opposed to beliefs that someone thinks that you're a piece of shit or that you're great.
Amen.
Because both of those things can always go away.
That's so good. Thanks for saying that.
Thank you. Sin. So sin is what religion has used since the dawn of man, called different things, of course, to separate the good from the bad. It's, again, totally ego-driven because it's something that we use. We claim against certainty that God thinks this is a sin, and then use it to control the masses. And I use a lot of examples in the book of them doing that, like making potatoes a sin, which resulted in mass genocide. I say that with a smile on my face, only because I think it's so ridiculous. And the sins, I thought, were from day one till now that they had stayed consistent, and they haven't. Everything has changed according to agendas. Everything has changed according to meanings. I mean, even taking the Lord's name in vain originally meant using God as your witness. We do that every day in court. We do that every day with our congresspeople or anyone going into government. Do you swear on the Bible? All of these things. And that was the sin, saying, taking the Lord's name in vain. Now it's cursing or anything like that. So to find out that sins lacked consistency, a lot of them morals, ironically enough, and used for control, I really wanted to get down to what is a sin. And I no longer think that a sin is permanent on your soul. I align more with the Jewish belief of it's missing the mark. It's, you screwed up. It doesn't have any implication on your eternity or anything like that. And it doesn't, I don't believe is something that is, I say, if we use cursing or something like that, then God is a snob. People think that drinking is, a sin or, all of those things. I have come to the conclusion for myself that sin is intentionally hurting someone or intentionally putting your needs over someone else's. And that's just solved with apologies or corrective behavior. It's not something that dooms you into being a horrible person for the rest of your life. We are completely flawed. And thinking that we're not flawed, I think, is one of the greatest sins there is, because that causes more damage than anything. You screw up, you make up for it, you don't do it again. Kind of like what Jesus said.
Yeah. Well, it's such a departure from the way that not just Christianity, but religions in general. I would say, especially the Abrahamic religions. And I can't remember who it was that coined the term, but I think it was Michael Hardin. I don't know if you know who he is, but anyway, he introduced me to the term holiness codes, because that was for so long what we have deemed as sin is nothing more than a holiness code. And so you go back through the Old Testament and you get through, there's hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of things that within their context, the Jewish people saw as abominations or sin or whatever. But I mean, it's a far cry from living according to a strict set of holiness codes versus this sort of larger, broader view of sin as what I would say, similar to what you said. I would say it's anytime I'm causing harm. Anytime I go against the grain of love, the consequences of that I would attribute to my sin. And I don't have to have a bunch of ego about that and say, well, if I do something that harms somebody, I need to remedy that.
We screw up.
Yeah.
Say you're sorry.
And some of those screw ups are much worse or not than others. There are some that are really, really cataclysmic. But like you said, that doesn't mar your soul. It doesn't, and that's the thing that we grew up with all the time was this whole notion of original sin. I remember standing in front of a bunch of teenagers and for every nice thing I said to teenagers, I said some stupid shit too. All right. And I was working this retreat and I had this outline of a talk I was supposed to give. And, and I remember telling them like what I thought was really good news. It was like, listen, all you little, heathens, you're not sinners because you did something wrong. No, you were just born that way. So, hey, pressure's off. You were born sinful. It's not your fault. Now let's fix it. And I look back on those days and go, whoa, that's kind of a shitty thing to tell people. Like you were born and what was your crime? You were born, and that whole idea of being born with the stain of sin, that God, going back to what you said earlier about like, I'm a better parent than God. That makes me 100% better parent than God. That I would never punish my children for their siblings' mistakes or for their grandfather's mistake or for their great grandparent. I'm not gonna walk up to my kid and smack him and go, hey, you know what your brother did, and now I have to hit you for it. So
I'm going to enslave him because
we could get into that. I mean, don't get me wrong, man. I think there's a place for the Bible, but man, there's some god awful shit in there. There's some really indefensible, and if you ever want to just get twisted up, go watch some YouTube videos and watch people twist themselves into pretzels trying to justify the inerrancy of the Bible. And it will just...
Well, and I open up the book with that, right? I mean, the first title chapter is Honor Thy Father, ? So just not honoring this completely flawed, evil man could be construed as a sin, right? Or my mother. And so that's why it opens up with a question mark going, okay. And then we get to the sin, like, okay, let's really, flesh this out and go, how do we go? I introduced the blue laws where it said that you could kill your children if they were disrespectful. Population would cease to exist at this point. All of those things are really constructed to the time, agendas, eras, and not very few have to do anything with being mean or, it's property rights, it's God's rights, it's be submissive, as opposed to just don't be a dick. It's really what it boils down to.
Yeah. I think you could boil the whole of Jesus' message to that.
Exactly.
Our friend Matt did write a book about that. It's called Don't Be a Dick. And
right.
It's pretty darn good.
Right. Amazon gave him so much shit over that.
There's so much of that is, I don't know. It's compelling to me because it actually what it does for me, and not maybe this is true for you, Bethany, John, Sheri, I mean, what it does for me is it causes me to dig deeper and take the scriptures more seriously. Like because now I have to find a way. Okay, I don't think that that God reached down from heaven and penned these words perfectly. That to me is way beyond mythology. But I don't think they're worthless. So now if I think there's value there, I'm forced to look differently at them. And it just causes us to be a little bit more studious in what we do and not just, otherwise we just discard the whole project and move on. But is that, cause I feel like you've dug.
You have to be able to step away from that mentality that many of us were handed, that the Bible was written by the Holy Spirit and every word is inerrant. And if you can't step away from that, then there's no room for conversation or curiosity or wonder about God or expansiveness of who God might be, because God has to fit into the box that we were all handed. And you talk about that too, Sheri, in your book. But that area of sin becomes a space of manipulation and control. And like we label this sin more dangerous than another sin. And it's like it's a way that the church can kind of keep people in their place and keep them afraid of hell and then keep them there so that way their sins can be absolved somehow, because they're learning something new about Jesus every week at church. And I mean, I'm dealing with this right now with one of my church members, and it's really heavy because we're not tough enough on an area of sin that she sees as salvific. And she just messaged me and she's like, I am praying for your salvation. And I'm just like, what is going on? I don't even know what to do with this right now. But it's like even within that conversation, I can recognize she has the authority here. I no longer have any say in her life, and the relationship is damaged. It is like the connection that I thought we once had, because she now sees that I see something differently in scripture, is now not the same as it once was. And it's very, very sad. So I think like the Bible, if we see it as inerrant, if that's our paradigm, then that will define any kind of connection that we can have with other humans that think of things differently than us.
It builds a situation of isolation.
Absolutely.
Right. And it destroys relationship.
Yeah.
And didn't Jesus die to wipe away all of our sins?
Last time I checked,
I read that somewhere.
Yeah.
Something about like, it is finished. I don't know.
Right.
I don't know.
So the fact that the church is even still using sins, I think is kind of a sin.
Yeah. Well, even honestly, you could boil it down to just what you said there, because like when you change the word from sin to sins, like I think you've hit the mark. Like we've walked away from a concept of this larger concept of sin, which is what we've described, and sins, and you begin to enumerate them. Okay, now it's we don't drink, smoke, or chew, or go out with girls that do, which is what we were always. I mean, our whole upbringing was about the things that as Christians we would not do, and we virtually signed pledges to not go to R-rated movies. We weren't gonna go too far with the girls.
Listen to secular music.
We weren't gonna listen to secular music. We were going to commit to be, it was very, very, for every one thing you might be called to do, there were 100 that you were promising that you wouldn't do, because they'd taken the time to enumerate those sins. And now sin was always and forever just a specific action that was easy to avoid. Okay, fine. Don't go to rated movies. I guess I'm a good person now. I could be an asshole to my neighbor though, or I could have a lot of judgment in my heart towards somebody, or I could do all kinds of other stuff that I think is way more harmful to yourself and to others. But on the surface, we might look for all the world like we were, I think we took that idea of being a peculiar people and we changed the word peculiar and just made fucking weird. So just go out in the world and just be weird people, as though that was some sort of badge of honor we wore, that people would go. But the weirdness, I would say, was in Jesus' day, Jesus' early followers in particular, they were mocked for how loving they were. They were made fun of for how they did not seek vengeance and how they did forgive and how they went to their deaths very often with smiles on their faces as they, they're like, look at these stupid people. Like that was the thing people found, that was worthy of being mocked, and also what found compelling. And now we just look weird. Now we're just like,
well, it's like the ego edging God out. It's like we edge people out. We edge people out because it's that we cannot be in relationship with those no good sinners anymore.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. Good stuff. You know what gets me, Sheri? Here's what gets me. Is I'm scrolling through your table of contents. We've talked about 5% of your book.
I know, right?
Like maybe
it's a lot, but you know what? I wanted it to be a one-stop guide.
I meant that in a good way.
Okay,
look how much conversation has come out of the first 40 pages of your book. And
I love that.
I had highlighted some things I want to talk about. I'm like, you're just gonna have to buy the book, people. That's what you're gonna have to do. And I recommend, with your permission, I would recommend buy this book, get with a friend or two, and go through this. I like the fact that the chapters are fairly short. They would really lend themselves to a group discussion. Hey, let's just talk about chapter 16. Let's talk about, they're short enough. We could read it in a little bit and but the conversation that's going to come out of I'm shocked. It's amazing. So yeah, we've had an hour plus conversation, and we really have just scratched the surface. And I think that's awesome. Very, very well done.
Well, and I'm putting together a follow-up course because my launch team was like unanimous about it. They're like, okay, you drop all of this stuff on it. We want to talk it out. We want to talk more about it.
It's a good idea. Yeah.
So I have people like Tom Ward coming on and giving input on how they view what I talked about and expanding beyond that with documents, videos, their own work, and doing it like that. Right now I have about 13 contributors that are coming on, and their talks are 10 to 15 minutes, expanding on it. And that I'm hoping to release that middle of September.
That's awesome. And I love that you got, but we love Tom. We've had Tom on, 3 times.
I actually just wrote a piece for his next book last night.
Did you?
So
that's so cool.
Yeah.
We're supposed to have him on pretty soon. I want to talk about his trial and go through that whole process.
I'm actually doing a revision in the book, so if you buy the book now, you'll have a special copy.
What? See? All right, special podcast only. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I'm adding Tom's story because I mentioned a couple different pastors that had been excommunicated from their church for the LGBTQ inclusion. So I want to add Tom's in there. I also want to remove, I use 1 Corinthians 13 as a definition of love and as a marker for love. And I have recently seen the light in how ordaining submission for women and how it comes from a point of power. So I now want to take that paragraph out and really stress that it's empathy. So some minor changes that, for everything that as a whole, the message remains completely the same. And I want to do a trigger warning before the first section because it's getting a lot of people.
I mean, I could see that might be useful. I hesitate to use the word enjoy, but how about I found the first section of your book compelling as hell. It was tough. It was hard to read. It reminded me a lot of reading Felicia Merle's, like, I don't know if you read her book, John. You read, yeah. But her first half of that book is pretty autobiographical, and it's rough. I mean, but it's necessary. I mean, to put some context to what she's about to write and to what you're about to write, to put some context to it, and for us to gain that experience of seeing life through someone else's eyes and their experience. That's something that, to me, that's a gift. I'm proud of you for doing that. I thank you for doing that. I know it could have been easy because I know going through my own little bits of autobiography in my book, it brought up a lot of shit. It was like, I hadn't thought about some of this stuff in a while. I'm like, oh man, I'm getting pissed off all over again. And this happened 30 years ago. I'm like, oh, it does dread. So, but for you to be vulnerable and put some of that stuff out there that was, I'm sure was hard to write about, I'm sure it's hell hard to live through. But it just lends so much credibility to the rest of what you write. It just makes it that much more authentic. So, man, I tell you what, I don't even want to cut it short, but we do need to be mindful of your time. And I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Thank you for hanging out. Thank you for writing this book. I think it's going to do a lot of people a lot of good. And at the very least, there'll be a lot of good conversation that's sparked from it. That's always a good thing, right? John, Bethany, any closing thoughts before we say goodbye?
Go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, the ditto what you said. Thank you for taking the time to come and talk with us. It's amazing conversation. We're so happy to have you.
Yeah. And thank you for being so vulnerable in those beginning pages of your book, and then being here and being vulnerable here too. It's just, I don't know. I think that people will really connect with you because you allowed yourself to be seen, and that takes a lot of courage. So I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. It's so great talking to you guys.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheri.
Well, we'll make sure and link to obviously your book, but also your social. You're very active on Facebook, and I'm not sure you're on other social media platforms as well.
Everywhere.
Okay, so definitely. I'm an old guy. I just Facebook. I sometimes delve into TikTok, and then I find like 3 hours of my life has been stripped away, and I'm like, I just can't go back there. That's a thing. So
the TikTok hole.
It is, man. It's a deep, deep hole. But I do see I see what you put on Facebook quite a bit, and I usually am the one going, hell yeah, that's good stuff.
Awesome, thank you.
As a fellow instigator, I appreciate what you do in that space. But yeah, we appreciate you. Thanks so much. Make sure to go out and buy the book, everybody. Like I said, we'll link to all the stuff in our show notes, all the ways you can connect with Sheri. And until next time, y'all have a good one.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.